but my main job is actually to introduce our moderator, who will then introduce our main speaker. And in thinking about how to introduce him, I was thinking about what a week this has been that we've all just lived through, pretty momentous. There's some thrills of victory and some agonies of defeat and agonies of recounts. But I think that many of us feel that our democracy is holding on, maybe by its fingertips, but democracy is holding on, and I think one of the groups of people who are pretty key to that survival are independent journalists. We've seen that the trial by fire that many of them have been under in recent days, and most of us, I think, have relied on independent journalists to try to sift through the different points of view that are presented by different news sources. Each of us has our group of people that we trust, that we can read or listen to, that will give us the fairest interpretation of the facts possible. So independent journalists, really important, up there with librarians and teachers. So our moderator today is an entrepreneur and philanthropist, a background as a television editor, but what he has done in the last few years is something remarkable, which is he's created a home for independent journalists and a place where we can go to find stories that are important to our history, that are important to help us predict the future. This is the organization known as Retro Report, and you can visit their website, and you can follow them on Facebook, and very excitingly, you can, in the fall, I believe, see them on PBS as a broadcast show. Retro Report will be available to be seen on Friday nights. So that's a brand new development. Retro Report has all kinds of stories, some that are following up on things that happened in the 70s, some looking forward to the future. There's a story up about the future of gaming, future of genetics. So please visit them. They're also a nonprofit, like the library, so support them as well. They've won many awards, been nominated for and have won Emmys, Webby Awards, the Edward R. Murrow Award, awards for financial journalism. They're just a terrific organization, and so it gives me great pleasure to introduce the founder of Retro Report, Christopher Buck.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you for the plug for Retro Report. We are going to be on PBS in the spring. We wouldn't be, if we're ready. Don't put us on in the fall, that's too soon. It's fall now. Yes, in the spring on Friday nights. Thank you, Anita. Thank you to the board of the Desmond-Fish Library for putting this together. I'm very happy to be here to try to moderate a discussion with Chris. Christopher Hughes is an American entrepreneur who co-founded and served as a spokesman for the online social directory and networking site Facebook. He left Facebook to bring a digital approach to the Barack Obama presidential campaign and was the publisher and editor-in-chief of The New Republic from 2012 to 16. Chris is now the co-chair of the Economic Security Project, and earlier this year he published Fair Shot, Rethinking Inequality and How We Earn. So, ladies and gentlemen, Chris Hughes.
Thank you.
I think we got another mic for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So, Chris, fantastic book, great read. You reveal an awful lot of yourself. It was very...
Hopefully not too much.
I feel like I've gotten to know you pretty well. And you've covered an amazing amount of life for a 34-year-old, and it all began in Hickory, North Carolina. Your parents grew up working class, as did you. solid values. Your mom was from a farming family, and later became a teacher. And your dad grew up in Mount Airy, North Carolina, the town that Andy Griffith's Mayberry made famous. It was based on. And he became a paper salesman. You were an only child, and childhood memories from that era?
Well, you got all the key details right. Somebody did his pre-reading, which is nice. Well, I have all kinds of childhood memories, which I'm happy to share if it's relevant. But before I get into that, I just have to say how much of a privilege and an honor it is to be here today, to thank Chris for moderating today, Anita for extending the invitation, and to have the chance to support the library here. My husband and I have, yes, thank you. My husband, Sean, who unfortunately couldn't make it, he's at home. We have a 10-month-old baby who was going to make an appearance but was not in a mood where you wanted him to make an appearance. So my husband, unfortunately, is not here with me. He's at home with our son. But he and I have had a home here in Garrison since 2011. We got married in Garrison in our backyard. We, right after marriage equality, went to the town of Phillipstown to get our license. I think we were the first couple. They were a little surprised. Maybe not the first, but one of the first. Anyway, this place feels so much like home to us, and so to have the chance to do something to benefit such an important institution in town that we are and many others are able to take advantage of, it's just an incredible privilege. So thank you again for inviting me. Yeah, so I grew up in North Carolina, small town, Hickory, North Carolina. Most of you probably haven't heard of it. I had sort of an amazing, bucolic childhood in the 80s. My dad was a paper salesman. My mom was a public school teacher. They had worked themselves up. And the American dream for them had very much played out. They were part of the generation where her parents were mill workers, and before that, farmers. His had been the groundskeepers at a country club, and they had professional jobs. And we had a very solid middle-class kind of background. And from there, I ended up getting financial aid to go to a boarding school in Massachusetts, Phillips Andover. After that, I got financial aid to go to Harvard. Definitely the first in my family to ever, really leave the state to go to college. My mom had gone to college, but she was the first in her family to go to college. And while there, we started Facebook. So maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of the story, but the reason I'm mentioning it is because my story, if you look in without, really unpacking it, looks a lot like the American dream is supposed to work. Right, like up from the bootstraps, each generation's moving forward. We start Facebook, takes off, and the hockey stick growth is incredible. I end up making a lot of money at a relatively young age. Man, this is what America's supposed to be. I write the book in order to make the case that is fundamentally false. That what happened to me was not the result of a lot of hard work. I worked fine for 3 years and did my piece, but the amount of money that I made was completely incommensurate with the work that I put in. And what actually happened is not so comfortable for a lot of us to talk about, but we need to. I got lucky. That's what happened. My story, though, is not that rare, unfortunately. What keeps happening in our country is we have a small group of people who get enormously lucky. They work, but there are a lot of other people who work jobs like the folks who are serving us lunch today, or nurses or teachers who also work very hard, who are not getting lucky, who are not having the same outcomes. And it's because we've structured our economy to create stories like my own. So my husband and I have made a commitment to give away effectively all of our wealth in the course of our lifetime in order to try to make this playing field a little bit more even. And so that's what the book is about, and hopefully we can talk about a lot of that today.
So going back to North Carolina for a sec, I remember one part of the book you talk about the church that your family joined, a little more elite than perhaps the background of your family. Was there a charitable culture in that church and in that time?
There was. Sometimes it felt pro forma. It actually is one of the things that sometimes bothers me about charity today. We give a lot of money to charity. I think charity is very important. There are some institutions like the library and others who need every single dollar and probably more of that financial support. But I often think that we talk about charity and sort of stop thinking about the structural solutions to problems. So in my view, there are a lot of people who've made a lot of money over the past few decades. Some of them are generous, and they give bits of it away, but we cannot stop thinking about structurally what is happening to create these massive sources of wealth. And we have to, I think we owe it to ourselves and the institutions that we care about to say, yes, it's great to support charity, like where we grew up, like the families that we were around, but we also have to think about rewriting the rules of the economy, I think, so that we increasingly need charity less. I'm not arguing we do a lot of direct service giving. I think that's really important and we need more of it. But we also need to have a country where, teachers and nurses can afford to live in the communities that they grew up in, where, 52% of Americans right now can't find $400 in the case of an emergency. Let's say that one more time. Half of Americans cannot find $400, this is according to the Federal Reserve study, cannot find $400 in the case of an emergency, which tells a much bigger story. We're not here today, I think, just to talk about poverty. That's an important topic. But we are talking about something that affects much of the middle class in America and something that is structurally unsound and has not been this way historically. So yes, there's lots of charity where I grew up, which was important. There's charity now, but we also need to think about how are we structuring the systems so that in the long term, we need charity less.
Going back to when you were 14, you talk about...
Really want to talk about when I was a teenager.
A little more background. We'll get into it. You were driven to get out of North Carolina somewhere else. You did your own work first, you did a computer search for the best high school in the world. You found the Phillips Academy, Andover Phillips. You got your own, you figured out how to get the student aid to get there, you made a phone call there, you got there. What was driving you to make that move? Most 14-year-olds don't have that.
I think there were a lot of things going on. I was restless. I was doing well in school, didn't feel that challenged. I was gay, I wasn't out at the time, but this is as we say, blood red place in America. This is a very conservative place, and we were around a lot, not just politically, but also morally. So I think I knew at the time that I wanted something different. And my parents also had told me since I was, it's from earliest I could remember, you can do whatever you want. If you can imagine it, you should do it. They were amazing in that way. They also taught me to be very suspicious of the establishment. And so I think they felt a little out of place in Hickory, where we grew up. I felt a little out of place, a little misanthropic, and also suspicious of those in power. So for me, it was about taking them at their word, achieving, going to a place where I thought I could be challenged and move, and move to bigger and better places. And they were supportive of it and made it possible for me by saving, by scrimping, and by encouraging me to do it.
So Andover, then Harvard, your sophomore year, you roomed with Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook came to pass, and suddenly you're a wealthy man, and you and Sean made the decision to focus on international poverty as one of your philanthropic goals. Why?
Well, we zoom forward through a lot of that. So one of the things about the book is it's really sort of half memoir and half policy. So I talk about each one of these chapters in my own life, partially to make it readable and interesting, because you talk about inequality, sometimes it can get a little dry. But it also is how I came to this issue and why I work on economic insecurity every single day. So Facebook did take off. I mean, it was incredible. I mean, we can, if people are interested, we have a Q&A after this, we can talk more about the Facebook story, but it was almost like an overnight kind of success. Now, Facebook didn't go public until 2012, so it was, a full 8 years after we started it. So, it wasn't like I woke up one morning and then had all these zeros in my bank account. There was some, it happened what felt like gradually over time, but you zoom out, and it was effectively a kind of like overnight sensation. So, as Facebook exploded and it changed my life dramatically, we made this commitment to ourselves initially privately, and then we started to think about, okay, well, what's the biggest bang for our buck? Right, because we both grew up middle class, we both still are pretty thrifty, like look at the price tag on it, is it really worth that? What's it? So, and we took that kind of thinking to philanthropy and said partially because there's so many good causes, right? Like there's no shortage of causes. The question is how do you find where you're going to be the most impactful? So I'll make a long story short on this one. Internationally, when it came to poverty, one of the most surprising things to me, the most counterintuitive, was that dollar for dollar, the most effective aid interventions are not building schools and wells. They're giving poor people cash. And you read these studies and you're like, that can't really be true. Like, can you really trust people? What are they spending it on? And there have been now hundreds of studies that the World Bank has pulled together summaries of, the IMF, all kinds of prestigious research universities, and increasingly the entire international aid community is coming to this consensus. Nearly half of the World Food Programme's budget is now not food, it's cash. Lots of other international organizations are finding the same thing. And so you take a step back and you unpack that, and it turns out that particularly wealthy people, but wealthy, educated people, we often have a hard time believing that the poor know best for themselves. Because we like to believe that our actions made us rich, and so if someone else is, or comfortable middle class, so if someone else is not like that, they must have made poor decisions. And in reality, when you give a person $1,000, they tend to spend that money on their families, themselves, to improve their livelihood. So I originally came to cash as an intervention through the international angle and began to move money directly, like literally texting people living on less than $1 a day in Kenya, money, with no strings attached. There's a nonprofit that does that. And then after a couple years, as economic insecurity got more and more extreme in the United States in my own life, and I began to get more and more interested in economic issues, I started asking the same question. Well, if they can do this in Nairobi, if they can do this in Kenya, is it possible that that cash could be part of the solution, not the only solution, but part of the solution in creating economic opportunity in the United States? And turns out, spoiler alert, I think it is. I think it should be. I don't think it is not a silver bullet, but I think it should be at the core of how we think about the problem of inequality and economic opportunity.
So Nairobi was Give Directly, and before that, I think there was a bit on the Millennium Village, which was a project that was more infrastructure related. Yeah. But then you went straight to Give Directly, that was cash directly to families in Nairobi. I think it was $1,000 a year for a family making less than $1 a day. That's a significant boost in income. Almost you would think that might be disruptive in a negative way to do that. But what are the results of the Nairobi? So in that particular intervention, they have what's called a random control trial, which those of you who are familiar with drug testing might be familiar, might know how it works. With one group, you provide the intervention, and with another control group, you keep everything else constant. With the folks who get the cash, their kids are healthier, they have longer-term wealth and income, they have better nutrition indices, and they are less stressed.
So you see all of this in the macro data. I'll give you an example though of because sometimes it's hard to dig into that. So I went to the villages in Kenya twice, and the second time I went there, the way that Give Directly does it, it's not like some nonprofits who just cherry pick a couple like amazing stories and put them up and they just sort of repeat. Instead, they randomize it, so they don't know what a donor's going to find. So we find ourselves like truly in the middle of nowhere in East Africa, tromping around and sitting down with people in their homes, which happen to be mud huts. And you sit down, there may be a mattress if you're lucky, and you start talking to people about what did you do when you got it's $1,000, 2 installments of $500. And the stories are incredibly unsexy. They are like, people say, oh, well, I took my thatched roof hut and I made it 10. Okay, that makes sense. And then they say, well, because every single season I had to repair it, that cost $100. It leaks, and when it leaks, my kids get sick because there's water and it's moist, and the 10 is much more resilient. It's a capital, it's actually sort of brilliant if you think about it in economic terms. It's a capital investment in housing, which is expensive up front, which they couldn't pay for, but then has returns for 5 to 10, maybe more years. So you hear stories like that, and then you also hear occasionally some really inspiring ones. Like one guy on that particular trip, he said, well, I used the first half of it, I bought a keyboard. Again, middle of nowhere, there's not even electricity, so you're like, why did you need a keyboard? What are you doing with the keyboard? And he's like, well, on Saturday nights, we have parties all around in the different villages, and we try to get the radio, and sometimes it doesn't work, but I like music. And so now I go around, and on Saturdays and for weddings, he's the local entertainment. And so people pay him to be, and he could have never, the keyboard cost, $200, which he would have never been able to afford. With the second tranche, he bought a beehive. Why? Because people want honey, fresh honey. It's an ingredient that they need, and he didn't really mind being stung by bees. So anyway, my point is not that everybody's an entrepreneur. In fact, it's one of my issues with microfinance. I think microfinance is encouraging. But in most cultures, 1 out of every 10 people might be an entrepreneur. But that doesn't mean that nearly all, 9 out of 10 people, can't use cash in a way that improves their livelihoods. And we're talking a lot internationally, but the same thing bears out in the United States.
And really, when you give people cash directly, I would imagine that you're giving them the responsibility because they know what they want. They need more than a non-governmental agency might know. But you're also eliminating a lot of infrastructure costs, people costs that traditional charitable outreach uses.
Yeah, this is why a lot of conservative-leaning libertarian folks, I won't ask for any hands in this crowd, but particularly like this idea because it cuts out the middleman. So if you're suspicious of bureaucracy, if you're suspicious of a government minister siphoning away the money, particularly in the developing world context, a lot of folks prefer to, provide the money directly. So this particular idea, the idea of where we're going with this is creating an income floor for working people. In other words, saying that we can use cash to not just eradicate poverty, but help a lot of people in the middle class with a few $100s every single month. And even in the United States context, there's growing interest in it because it's a way to provide economic security, to create a foundation for people to live on in a way that is very, very efficient, very, very effective. Somewhat like the overall cost of Social Security, the administration of it is well less than 1% of the cash that's moved, because moving cash, it takes some work, but is largely a very efficient way of helping people.
Okay, so we get it. You take money and give it directly to people who need it the most, let them be responsible for spending it the way they think is best, but There have to be unintended consequences here.
Yeah, of course. So, so two things. So as we move to the US context, specifically what we're talking about is $500 a month for everyone who works and makes less than $50,000. So in other words, a lot of poor people, but also a lot of people who technically, according to economist definition, are part of the middle class. We're talking about $500 a month, so certainly not enough for anybody to stop working, put up their feet, play their video games, you name whatever you might be afraid of. People are afraid of different things, but it's a modest supplemental amount, and it's administered through the tax code as a way of really stabilizing the economic lives of people. Now, to answer your question, is somebody going to waste that money? You betcha. If you take a family of 30 people, there is always that one cousin who is not responsible with the money or who just can't stay in that job. That is absolutely true. The other 29 people will not. And in fact, what we know is that their kids will weigh more, they'll have higher birth weights. We know from empirical studies. Their kids will stay in school longer for every additional $1,000 that a family receives in these tax credits. They stay in school longer. They do better on tests. People go to the hospital less often. We can talk about why that may be, but we see this in the data. There are, and not to mention have lower stress levels, lower cortisol levels. So there are incredible benefits from it for the vast majority of people. There will be people, just like food stamps, just like Medicaid, you name a government benefit, and there are always people around the edges who may abuse it. But I think that we should agree that that shouldn't mean that we should stop one of the most tested benefits from helping the 95% of people who need it very badly today in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can make the argument that any charitable program is going to have negative effects as well as positive effects, and it's just a matter of weighing the balance between the positive versus negative. So define two things: universal basic income versus guaranteed income.
Yeah, so I don't think I'm not scared of the rise of the robots. Sorry if that is disappointing to people. Sometimes people expect me, because of my background in technology, to be really interested in UBI, called Universal Basic Income, which is an idea that some of you may... Actually, can we raise hands? How many people have heard of UBI, Universal Basic Income, just to feel the crowd out? Okay, so about half the group. So there's a movement about that, a lot of it comes out of Silicon Valley, that believes that the end of work may be nigh, that jobs might be over, that artificial intelligence and machines may very well just reduce the overall number of jobs, that self-driving cars will put a lot of people out of work, that you'll need significantly fewer teachers in classrooms, et cetera. Are you part of this school?
There's bartenders in Las Vegas now that are robots.
Exactly. And Applebee, I doubt this is a crowd that goes to Applebee's very much, but if you go to the Applebee's, there are things where you can order on your table, et cetera. So there's a lot of concern about this. I actually am not part of this school. It may be true, it might not be true. So far, there's zero evidence to suggest that it's true. The overall number of jobs is not going down. If anything, unemployment rates are lower. There is, as yet, no evidence that AI is going to reduce the overall number. This time, it may be different. I'm not, if we were debating it, it's hard for me to say definitively this isn't going to happen, but it's certainly not my justification for a guaranteed income. So the reason I'm talking about this is because a lot of folks who do worry about the automation worry that jobs are over. And for them, there's an idea of using a UBI as a way of creating a social safety net, the safety net of the future. So my view is that jobs are definitely changing. There are a lot more gig economy jobs, part-time jobs, contract jobs, seasonal jobs, very unstable jobs. And what we need today is an income floor to stabilize work already in America. So household incomes in the United States have not risen meaningfully in over 40 years. I'll just say that again. Even though the macro numbers today, unemployment is at record low, wages are not yet rising in any meaningful way, and they have not risen in 40 years. But you know what has? The cost of living, which probably even many people in this room feel. Healthcare, more expensive, even accounting for inflation. Education, childcare, housing, all of it, nearly 20% higher than they were 20 years ago, even accounting for inflation, even though wages are effectively still flat. So my view is we need a guaranteed income as, again, not as a silver bullet, but as an important stabilizing feature that would improve the incomes of the families who need it most, enable them to reach the first rung of the economic ladder and begin to climb up it. We need other structural reforms in the economy, higher minimum wages, don't get me started about all the things that we need a better healthcare system, climate policy, we need those things too, but sometimes we overlook the simplest solutions when they're right under our noses, and in this case, I do think that a guaranteed income, specifically administered through the tax code as a monthly tax credit, could be transformative.
And indeed, as you point out in your book, we have already done this experiment.
Yeah, we're already doing it.
In various ways. During the Johnson administration 50 years ago, they did a very deliberate program. I forget the geographic area that was carried out in.
Well, the biggest supporter at the highest level of government historically for this idea is none other than Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon did a televised address in 1972, beamed into every single home in the United States in support of what was called a negative income tax bill. So effectively using the tax code to give the families who need the boost up, the support the most. Passed the House of Representatives, and it failed in the Senate for multiple reasons, one of which was because a lot of left-leaning folks did not think that it was enough money. Other reasons too. However, we got very close to having a policy of this nature 40, 50 years ago, and there were all kinds of pilots and experiments that were happening then. The group that I co-run is starting some pilots now, and we're certainly trying to change the law in a few states and hopefully nationally too, to begin to pave the way for this kind of policy.
And
to be part of the problem.
Milton Friedman himself was a big proponent of this back in the Nixon days.
Which, if you share my politics, should be a big red flag, beware. So, yes, it is true that Friedman did like the idea of a negative income tax, largely because of these efficiency concerns that I was talking about a little bit before. But it has united the left and the right. So the structure that we could use, and I know it's after lunch and I'm about to talk about taxes, so just give me 90 seconds to talk about it and then we don't have to talk about it. But like the structure that I think we should use is called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which already exists. It's the largest cash transfer program in the world. $70 billion every single year goes out to middle class and poor families. We know a lot about how it works. We know a lot about what people spend it on, and it's wildly popular on the left and on the right. So every president since Gerald Ford has meaningfully expanded it, Republican and Democrat alike. Ford, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush II, and Obama, not this president yet, although it was discussed a little bit in the tax bill last year. And the reason is because folks on the left and folks on the right, everybody likes a middle-class tax cut, which is what this is called and which is how it works. So it has been a very popular policy historically, and it gives a lot of us hope for the next few years too.
Well, so where does the Earned Income Tax Credit expansion stop and guaranteed income start?
So the tax credit currently works, you get it once a year, and it stops around $30,000. So what we talk about is expanding the amount that you get, making it monthly, bring it all the way up to families who earn $50,000. Actually, Senator Kamala Harris, this is like real legislation she introduced 2 weeks ago. So this is not just like Chris talking about an idea that he thinks is clever. Like, there are a lot of policymakers who are thinking about this. So Senator Kamala Harris's bill that she introduced 2 weeks ago would take it all the way up to $100,000. So every family up to $100,000 would get some amount every single month. In the book, I talk about taking it up to $50,000. It's a little bit less expensive to do so, where you get a monthly credit, and it can be delivered by direct deposit or on a debit card, similar to how we do food stamps today. One key thing that I think is critical to get done as we think about doing this is expanding the definition of work. So historically in the tax code, and right now for the Earned Income Tax Credit, in order to count as a worker, you've got to be doing paid wage labor. So what that means is we tell a lot of moms, for the most part, it's moms and dads, but it's mostly moms, who are taking care of young kids, that's not work. All that cooking and cleaning and the sleepless nights, that's not real work. You got to go work at Burger King. And then once you get a wage job paying you a minimum wage, then we will recognize that as legit work, and then you can qualify for the Earned Income Tax Credit. And what we've seen, not just because it's the right thing to do, but also in public polling, is that what Americans, again, on the left and in the center at least, view as work today has expanded significantly. So what we want to do is take a broader definition of work that includes child care, elder care, education, and even other kinds of activities which are a little bit harder to do, but perhaps possible, and say as broadly as we can, as long as you are doing something for yourself, your family, or your community, you shouldn't live in poverty. That's like the bumper sticker promise, and what's more, you should get several $100s a month to help you keep up with the rising cost of living. So that's what Senator Harris is out there talking about on the campaign trail now. I think we'll see some other 2020 contenders talk about it. We're seeing some folks in states talk about it, and that's the boiled down, more simplistic version.
And the first question that a taxpayer asks when he hears about this is?
Who's paying for it?
Who's paying for it?
The 1%. I think, and I think this is really important. So whenever there's a whole debate about when we talk about this stuff, politicians are often asking, should we talk about the pay-fors? And I think on this in particular, we should and we must. Not only because it is expensive, and we do need to be responsible as we think about how to pay for all these things, but also because it gives us an opportunity to talk in rooms like this one about how unfair our tax code has become. The rates on income and on capital gains are at historic lows. And in many cases, I pay a lower tax rate than our cleaning lady, which is just fundamentally not only unfair, but out of line with what I would call the American dream, but also the American outlook. And it hasn't always been this way. The tax code, over the course of the 20th century, after the Second World War, tax rates on people like me, on the top 1%, were around 50%. It happened to be the period in America where we had the most growth. We were growing each year at double the rates that we are now, and the period where that growth was the most widely shared. There was a general sense of shared prosperity. And so in the book, I make the case that to pay for all the stuff that we're talking about, we should bring rates from where they are now, around 35% on the top, back up to 50%. And we should ensure that the rates that we pay on investment income are in line with the rates that we pay on as earned income, as wage income. You do that and you close a couple other loopholes, and you have paid for this program. And it's about the same cost as the Trump tax bill that was passed last year. So anybody who says to me, well, Chris, you are just like dreaming. This is just way too big. This is just way too expensive. if we can find over $1 trillion for corporate tax cuts and tax cuts on the top 1%, then why can't we find the same amount of money for the poor and the middle class who need the money so much more intensely than they have in decades? I just don't think that's square, and I particularly want liberals and folks on the left to feel a sense of confidence in making that case, because somebody's going to have to rebalance the tax code over the next 10 to 20 years, and there's nobody else to do it if it's not going to be us. I get worked up.
So to explore and implement, you have created an organization called the Economic Security Project, and you've decided to start it quietly, slowly gathering information. What was the impetus behind that decision?
So, yeah, we have a nonprofit that's working on this in multiple different ways. We try to provoke the conversation and also legitimize it. So we're doing things like a big pilot in Stockton, California, where we've created a guaranteed income there to support the mayor, who is a phenomenal generational kind of leader. He's the youngest mayor of any major American city. He's taken this on despite some risk and is incredible. So we fund that, and we also fund a lot of policy work. We have done it somewhat quietly, and I think it's for a whole host of reasons. Number one, I don't know I don't know how many of you have followed the story in Stockton, but the opportunity to provoke and have someone leading that conversation who is a black mayor who grew up in a single-family household in poverty is so different than it is to have an economist or a philanthropist, or someone like me, to be honest, leading that kind of conversation. So I wrote the book because I am proud of this work. I do think it's important. I want to have the opportunity to be in rooms like this one to talk about this. But really, on the front lines, the people who should be doing this work are people like Mayor Tubbs. Someone else just earlier was talking to me about another woman named Aisha Nyandoro, who's doing something similar down in Jackson, Mississippi. There's a pilot that's about to be announced somewhere in the Midwest, which I could go into detail privately. There's a lot happening, and so rather than have some big splashy new initiative, we'd rather build a network where we can add value, but we can support a whole chorus of voices working on this and hopefully investing in it for the long term.
Fantastic. We've kind of run through quickly some areas, spent a little more time on others, but I wanted to give everybody a chance now to revisit things that we might have glossed over quickly, or to ask more in-depth questions about the Economic Security Project. So
we can talk about anything. If you guys want to know Facebook, anything you want. Open book. We can talk about the New Republic. We can talk about time in the nonprofit sector. We can talk about Mr. Obama. You name it, I'm happy to talk about whatever's interesting.
So you mentioned that you've suggested $50,000 as the threshold for like $500 a month. I'm just curious why not do the same amount for everybody, from someone who doesn't have a job and needs money all the way up to the richest individual in the country. Just give them all the same amount. It takes away the stigma completely, and there's absolutely zero bureaucracy around it, or the potential to not make it be a threshold, because $500 a month at $50,000 is like 12%, and to go from like 49 to 51 and see your income drop like significantly like that, that creates that threshold argument that you hear all the time where people are like, this person poorer than me is getting this help, and I am working so hard and just did so well that I don't get any help. It gets people really upset. So like, I'm just curious about why still the old ideas of buckets, or maybe the possibility of a real sliding scale that always makes it like available that you want to make the next dollar whether you're getting help or not.
Clearly, that's the way it needs to be designed. So the challenge, one of the challenges I had with writing this book is exactly the challenge we're living right now, is how to talk about this in enough detail that we talk about the importance of how it operates, but not so much detail that it's like a policy book. However, anytime given the invitation to talk about the policy stuff in more detail, I will happily and enthusiastically take it. So in the way that the policy really should be designed is like most economic policies, where you have a curve out, you have a phase out, so you never cross the line. You go from getting $500 a month when you make $49,999 to zero. The curve will go down. So as you make $55,000, you might get $400. As you make $60,000, you get $300, all the way until you do reach a 0 point, which is how the tax policy works now. So there are, for folks who are interested in this, the Urban Institute is doing a landmark report in conjunction with some other groups to answer all of these questions. And Senator Harris's office, and in the House, Congressman Ro Khanna and Bonnie Watson-Coleman from here in New Jersey all have different kinds of legislation to answer this exact question: how should it be graphed? But you're right that you shouldn't have what we call a cliff, that it should be phased out. There's, to the other half of your question though, there are arguments for making it more universal. It makes it much more expensive, and at the end of the day, I don't think that we need the top 10, 20, 30% getting the money to get rid of the taboo. I think if you're going up to families making $50,000, you're actually touching 40% of Americans. So policies that touch 40% of Americans should feel very different. Like, for instance, Medicaid doesn't get anywhere near that, but there's not a significant taboo with that as you might imagine with quote-unquote welfare. And if anything, it actually makes it more resilient. And one of the reasons why the ACA, has not been repealed, I think, is because there are so many people getting it. So what I'm trying to do, and what others who are working on this are trying to do, is find a balance between not giving it to everyone, which makes it very expensive and is probably unnecessary, and also not just making it an anti-poverty policy, because this is about something, it should help with poverty, but this is also about something bigger, about creating stability for working people more broadly.
Earlier in your statement, you talked about structure and restructuring the fundamental system, and then later you addressed guaranteed income as a stabilizing feature. And I'm curious, as I see a little dissonance there. What are we stabilizing against? What are we stabilizing if we want to restructure? That's part one. And number two, you also mentioned Africa and your visits to Africa. And I'm curious as to your personal experience with the adoption of cryptocurrency there, because that's really changing the face of money and wealth. And certainly the way we move wealth around the world, it's a lot more efficient, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, in the first, I think you put your finger on a tension in this work, because we got to walk and chew gum at the same time. So I think we have to stabilize the financial lives of the middle class and poor now. And I do use the word stabilize because what you see in the data is that the poor, we tend to think of the poor as like homeless people, and they're like over there, and they're always poor, and they're just hopeless. But in reality, what's happening is you're seeing people who are just losing one paycheck or one kind of emergency, and they dip into poverty. And then they come back out of it when they are able to get another job, or there is some kind of seasonal event or what have you. And so when I talk about stabilizing, what I'm really talking about is helping people have a little bit more to not just make ends meet, but to be able to rely on. But it is in tension with some of the structural economic reforms that need to happen. It's not in tension with it, but you must do the structural things at the same time. So for instance, if we don't figure out healthcare policy, and I would offer a Medicare option for all, then you could have a lot of this money eaten up in healthcare expenses. If you don't think about housing policy, you could have a lot of this money eaten up in the rents to landlords, which doesn't help anything. And I think if you don't think about the corporate concentration of power if we don't return to an era like we had from the teens until really the 70s, where we had a much more active antitrust policy in the United States, then you could end up with a few small corporations just getting bigger and bigger and more powerful. And by the way, many of the tech companies I would put into that bucket. So I think we have to have a conversation about, not just a conversation, we have to have action on antitrust, healthcare, housing. You could go across at climate. If there's a climate disaster, then who? We have to talk about these things in tandem. And sometimes it's overwhelming for me, as I imagine it might be for you, because, good Lord, what are we doing here? We're not going to solve the whole all these political problems on a Sunday afternoon at the Highlands. But at the same time, we do have to think about the intersectionality of all of these things. So I start with a guaranteed income because it's something that I feel passionately about. My personal story is connected to it, but by no means if I were king for the day, I would not just create a monthly EITC and call it a day. I think it would have to happen in conjunction with some of these other structural changes. I know nothing about blockchain in Africa, so I will let others who do speak to that more thoroughly.
Alaskans have had guaranteed income since 1976 from their oil proceeds.
$2,000 a year for every single man, woman, and child.
What has been the result? Is that a stabilizing factor in their lives?
State with the lowest income inequality in the United States? Alaska. State with the most resilient support for this, it's called the permanent fund dividend. Alaska is a red state. They just made they elected a lot of Republicans on Tuesday, is Alaska. People really don't see this as a handout. They see it as now something that is a fundamental, it's the foundation of what it means to be an Alaskan. When you're in Alaska, you don't have it made. They're incredibly hardworking, but you do every October get a check for $2,000 for everybody in your household. So if you have a family of 4, you get $8,000 every single October, and people are shocking. People love it, but they also understand that it's part of what makes their state special. And they would rather, by a 2-to-1 margin, they would rather increase or create an income tax, property tax, or sales tax than give up the dividend. They'd rather be taxed than give up the universal benefit.
Chris, is this on? Yep. First, thanks a million for giving the time and participating in this occasion today. It's really a fulfillment of part of our aspiration and our mission to conduct a public conversation in this community and beyond around the issues that have such an impact on our lives, and it's really wonderful to hear your articulation of these questions. I'd like to take you up on your multiple requests for a question around Facebook, and also to say, so you don't have to, that you got out of that environment before some of the recent problems have surfaced in such a controversial fashion. But obviously the two main issues that have had such a really profound impact on our lives are the privacy questions, and also the question around how much we can trust the information relationship of the corporate culture to the current unfolding of these questions.
Well, I mean, the headline is, I think they're working on it, but they have their work cut out for them. And I think that applies to privacy and what I would call sort of the democracy conversational issues, but does not apply so much to the antitrust concentration of power. So there are, I mean, as much as I feel a sense of connection to the whole Facebook team, I also think it's incredibly important in the long-term terms, Facebook and the rest of us will, to just name these problems. So I think that there are 3 buckets, and you named 2. The first is privacy. And specifically, I think the problem is not just with the privacy statements and what people sign up for or don't sign up for, but with the sea change that has to happen in all of our minds socially and culturally to realize how much data we're creating. And it's not just on Facebook. It's every time you go to Food Town with your little card. It's every time you have your Alexa on in your kitchen. If you have a newer digitally powered automobile, it's for instance, every time I get in my car, it knows exactly how fast I'm going and where I'm going. And when all of this data that's being created is so big, and right now it's a free-for-all. The companies technically have access to it. Why? Because we blow through these terms of service agreements without really realizing them. That is not sustainable for people in the long run. If people don't understand what data they're creating and who's getting it and when and why, then it's not, I don't think, a resilient kind of system. So that is such a big problem that Facebook can and should make important short-term consequences to privacy statements, but that's not going to be enough. It has to be a much broader civil society kind of conversation. The second is the democracy issues. They are making some headway on changing the news feeds so that there's some verification issues. Is it enough? I don't know. I still worry that Facebook is a part of the process, part of the digital infrastructure that's pulling us apart more than bringing us together. Mark wants to change that. He really wants to change that as a leader and as an individual. Whether he will be able to, I don't know. There is no question to me that he feels a sense of responsibility as an individual to change that. It may be bigger than him. I don't know. I'm on the side of it's not. He's the CEO. He's in control. He can make all kinds of changes to the platform. Some of them may be painful. Some of them may mean less attention on the site and less money. But that may be where Facebook ends up needing to go. And then on the third one, I do think that it's problematic that really the internet is dominated by 4 or 5 companies. Between Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Google, and Netflix, I mean, that is effectively the lived experience of most people today. That wasn't what the original people who created the internet wanted it to be. I think that it doesn't serve us well in the long term for consumer welfare, but it also doesn't serve our politics or polity very well. So that is why I think we should talk about. I'm not saying you necessarily got to go break them all up, but one example is Amazon is at once the framework, the store for every good under the planet, and they create a lot of those goods. They should have, this is a classic antitrust problem that we've dealt with before, they should have certain laws and regulations which say you need to if you're going to be the store and produce the items in the store, then either you have a set of responsibilities to ensure that you're not collecting data from those competitors to put them out of business, or you need to separate the businesses themselves. Same thing goes with Google and with search. When you search for a restaurant and Google uses their review technology and puts it up top, they have used one product, search, to prioritize another product, reviews, which, by the way, is a multi-billion-dollar industry with all kinds of other people, with other kinds of businesses that are threatened, if not put out of business, because Google's owning the platform and the product at the same time. We've seen this before in transit. We've seen it in other industries. We know we know generally ways to approach these problems. The FTC is holding hearings this fall. I think, economically speaking, we need to think through these things because we don't want a country where there's just a handful of companies that have an incredibly deep concentration of power. So those are the 3 areas I think that are challenges, problematic with Facebook and with some of the other companies that we shall be paying attention to. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. I know we're already well over our time, but Anita, we'll take 2 more. Let's say, does that work for you, Chris?
Chris, I was born in Stockton, California. Google it. Can you tell us a little bit about the experiment there and how you're measuring? How do you evaluate what works and what doesn't?
So do you want to tell us about the mayor at all? Or should I? Okay, you don't. So the mayor of Stockton is Michael Tubbs. He's the guy I was describing before. He's 28. He's the youngest mayor of a major city, and he has a pilot where they're providing $500 a month to several hundred families. Or it's about 125 families. And the idea is that it's an opportunity to provoke the conversation and to talk about deservedness and what we owe one another. At the same time as that pilot is happening, there are several other pilots that are starting, and there's several international as well. We have a lot of science behind this stuff already. We could use more, but the real point of the mayor's pilot there is to create a story around what it means to provide people with cash and how to create economic opportunity. So already, I was just there 2 months ago. I was there several times before, and it's a city of 300,000 people. A lot of people live in Stockton, and the entire city knows about the pilot. Everybody, of course, wants to be a part of it, but everybody's already talking about, what do you mean money for nothing? And people say, well, it's not actually money for nothing. We're all working really hard here, and you're making the same thing you've been making for decades, and this is a boost to help you keep up with the housing, since it's going bananas, because Silicon Valley, everybody's moving in from it. And then people say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So it's an opportunity to have that kind of broad-based cultural conversation as much as it is to develop additional social science around the transfers.
With regards to your project, do you have an educational component to it? Because a lot of times people get money, and even though they may be poor and can only spend on a few things, sometimes understanding how that money could potentially build more money over time, that would be very helpful as well to help them get out of poverty.
Absolutely. And one of there's a fierce debate around income or wealth transfers, and I don't think there's one right answer. What I hear in a lot of these conversations, like I was in Jackson earlier this year with this project that I mentioned before, with a lot of single moms in public housing, and what they said to me is, I spend my entire day either trying to find a job or chasing government benefits. And I was like, okay, well, what do you mean? What is that like? And then they took me through. On Wednesday, I got to go get my Medicaid card refilled. There's no public transportation. So I got to go there. The bus comes once an hour, so they go and they wait at the bus stop for an hour. They go there. At the government office, it's as inefficient as we might fear. And they're able to navigate the bureaucracy if they're lucky, and then they get home, and that's the entire day. It's now 4:30. What job interview have you ever done at 5? So then the next day they can interview for a job, but then the next day they're back, dealing with the SNAP benefit, the food stamp benefits. So anyway, we've created these cycles of reliance very purposefully. So I see income as a springboard, but not as an antidote to the wealth gap issues. And specifically, when people get the income, there are tests running now about whether or not it's best to say, you could do X, Y, or Z with the income as a kind of guidance. I'm waiting for the research on that, because there's also a lot of evidence that financial literacy training does nothing. That there are no long-term benefits to the literacy. There's actually quite a lot of research on that. So my point is, I think income problems are key, but they're best when they're tied with wealth-building programs as well, and when they happen in tandem. And we'll learn more over the next few years about really what is the best way to deliver the money and with what other services alongside.
Well, on the one hand, giving money to people who need it is the most intuitive way you could think of to help somebody. On the other hand, it's incredibly not intuitive to change what we've been doing our whole lives. So I thank you for bringing this book to us, to broadening the conversation, to forwarding it. It's certainly something that seems to be gaining a lot of traction in a lot of different areas. So it seems like it's going to be a thought that's going to be with us to stay. And so again, thank you for bringing it to us, and thank you for your time today, and for everything that you've done.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks everybody. Thank you, Anita.
or read that you want to explore the idea of a data dividend, where because you've seen so many social media companies, technology companies get extremely wealthy using data that millions of people provide, and that idea resonates very positively, I think. How would you see that getting started, or?
Well, I think what's going on is that pretty much every single person in the United States and many people globally are creating an immense amount of data every single day we go about our lives. Certainly on Facebook, on Google, but also when we go grocery shopping, when we go driving, our cell phones know where we are at every single minute. If you've got an Alexa in your kitchen, she knows what you're saying a lot. Amazon knows what you're saying a lot of the time, and for the most part, that's a good thing. People want that. However, I think there are two questions that we need to ask. First is, do we have privacy laws that safeguard that data appropriately? And then secondly, all this data we're giving away for free is creating historic profits for many of these companies. And so one question is, if we're creating so much of this data, that's driving so much of this financial success, might it be possible for each of those participants to be compensated for some of that data, a kind of data dividend, if you will? Now, it's a complicated idea, it seems simple, but there's all kinds of questions. Okay, well, exactly how would you tax it? How would you make sure that everybody got the same amount? Of course, the Alaskans have done this with oil, so there is precedent, but there are still a lot more questions and answers. And so I'm of the school, of the crew that believes we should be asking those questions and getting a lot of experts, getting academics, think tank leaders, technologists, everybody having a much more robust conversation about whether or not something like this is even possible. As someone who has a deep passion for and appreciation for Garrison and the Garrison community, I love the Desmond-Fish Library, everything that you and the whole team do to make it a special place, and everything that it does to make our community more knowledgeable, more vibrant, and as a home for a lot of curious minds, little ones and adults, both alike. So thank you for having and for doing what you do, and for supporting the institution so that so many of us can take advantage of it.
Thank you.